Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're going to be talking about the newest album from James Blake called Assume Form. So am I the only one who is a little bit surprised there is so much hype surrounding this album, or indeed surrounding James Blake at all? I get that he's quietly racked up the sort of credits and connections for production details and work that you'd be hard-pressed to notice, but it's not exactly the sort that seems designed to build much of a big following, let alone a more mainstream one. Now, granted, it's not like James Blake has been entirely in the indie scene. He's had his mainstream connections. He's had hip-hop verses as early as his second album, Overgrown, of which I go back and forth whether or not it's better than his debut. They're both great. And again, he's had credits on songs with Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar. And I guess I shouldn't be that surprised that he'd have some crossover appeal. In comparison with any number of experimental electronic artists, even some that he's worked with, he's probably one of the most accessible. But you know what? I remember in my review of The Color of Anything that I said I wasn't sure if he would ever cross over, or if he even wanted that. Granted, if said crossover was going to help him tighten up a flabby album that lacked a lot of character that made his first two albums so striking. Seriously, The Color of Anything has aged rather poorly since 2016, and I think I was going too nice on it even then, but I wasn't exactly going to be against that, but I was skeptical about this album. While Overgrown had credits from the RZA and Brian Eno, and The Color of Anything had Frank Ocean and Bon Iver, this album has credits from Metro Boomin and Travis Scott. Now, granted, James Blake's worked with Travis Scott before, and it's also got a verse from Andre 3000, and the critics have been praising this to high heavens, so I had reason to believe this could be great. So does James Blake deliver on Assume Form? Well, here's the thing. When I was initially structuring this review and going through my first couple of listens, nearly all the critical reception that James Blake had been receiving with this album had been rave reviews. And to the surprise of a lot of folks, the indifferent, outright mixed reviews started dropping pretty soon after. And what I found genuinely funny upon reading all of them is the sense of shocked indignity that permeated so many of the mixed reviews, that James Blake had made a sudden change from their projected veneer of his personality and his art. The brand they set out for him, he's not really there anymore. And while I won't deny that James Blake has shifted his overall approach and sound, when I'm going through the content and the framing, I'm not at all surprised that James Blake wound up here, which might have been to the detriment of previous projects, but actually winds up working pretty damn well. Now, does this mean I like or even love the album? Well, let's not get too hasty here, as I'm still not quite sure this project quite matches the self-titled album or Overgrown. It is absolutely better than The Color of Anything, though. Again, I overpraise that. But I can say while those first two projects absolutely monopolize a very specific vibe for me, Assume Form has a versatility and a flair that's not only more accessible, but in a funny way, feels a lot more emotionally honest. And I think to explain some of that, we need to start off with James Blake himself, and a necessary misconception that needs to be cleared up. For as much as there has been this detached, melancholic edge in James Blake's soulful delivery, he was never so much of the sad boy that music writers branded him. He was thoughtful and pensive, a little bit anxious and depressive, internally focused to the expense of damn near everybody else, but he absolutely had an ego that could actually clash with the content of some of his relationship songs, which didn't really translate well when he swamped himself out with dampening reverb that only served to isolate him further. Hell, there were significant chunks of The Color of Anything where that tonal dissonance between his content and sound created a sourness that was about the worst possible emotion to stick within all the dreary soundscapes. And what I like about Assume Form is that, right from the start, James Blake is at least making the effort to not detach, which reframes some of the ego that runs through this album with a very different tone. He's upfront about tempering his soulful side with a little bit more confidence, or dare I even say cockiness, or at the least the sense that he might be enjoying some of the fruits of his success and love. And that means that he's using a little bit less of his falsetto. Well, I'm fine with that too. I've always liked James Blake's mid-range, and when he brings in more vocal harmonies like on the superb song Power On, he sounds great. I'm happy with it. Now granted, if you want to ask the question of how convincing he is in delivering some of that sentiment, that's a different question, and it takes us to the production and a lot of these compositions, where James Blake is stepping across a broader palette this time around, from the downbeat, auto-tuned R&B to slightly more rougher, atmospheric trap to even touches of vintage pop and soul. soul, with passages most reminiscent of the mid-60s, or even more soul music from the mid to late 70s thanks to the Manhattan sample on Can't Believe the Way We Flow. And all of it is graced with a touch of opulence and elegance that does stand in contrast to the restrained, almost folk touches of previous projects, which, yes, you can't deny that it's less obviously tasteful than previous projects, but that mirrors the content, and coupled with the tighter structure and a little bit more melodic groove, gives the album a fair bit more momentum, actually able to play with some jarring dramatic contrast a little bit more effectively in the compositions, while the production remains as restrained as ever, if not precisely subtle. Hell, the strings are only used as accent touches, but they're lush and full, touching off the title track and even better off of Are You In Love and I'll Come Too, but never precisely decadent as James Blake balances things out with the increasingly brittle percussion and the more steady vocal layering, a give and take between the organic and the synthetic foundation that complements a lot of his vocals, and the passionate swings that he will take on this project. And that's before we get to the darker, more trap-inflected cuts, and to my surprise, I actually preferred Travis Scott's bleary-eyed chemistry with James Blake on the hedonistic Mile High to the discomfort of the one-night stand running long on Tell Them, with Moses Sumney's cracking falsetto that was good but didn't quite click for me. But of course, the biggest standout here is the stalking, murky beat of Where's the Catch, that creaks and stutters even as Andre 3000 drops into a ruthlessly focused verse that balances against the overthought suspicion from James Blake. Even when they chop things into ribbons on the outro, it's a really effective moment, probably the best song here. Now on the flip side, I will say that some of the percussion choices can lead to this weirdly cheap feeling density that doesn't really fit with the atmosphere, mostly notable for the rattle against Rosalia's breathy delivery on Barefoot in the Park, or the oddly tinny auto-tune on Into the Red really did not fit that song there. But really, these are all surrounding the arc of this album, in which James Blake emerges from his cocoon of detached ego in order to extend some passion. And really, your mileage might vary depending on how pompous it can all come across. For me, the worst moment on this album hit on Into the Red, which shows him a little bit too enamored with how much the girl is overextending herself for him, and not quite showing the self-awareness to realize that he's never quite done the same. At least not on that song. Indeed, as the arc of the album proceeds and we get cuts like Are You In Love, it serves as a bit of a demystification of his assumptions, which leads into some real insecurities returning on Where's the Catch, and highlighting just how fragile some of his ego might be. And if there's an emotional sentiment that James Blake just knocks out of the park here for me, it comes from the risk of engagement. You might be able to ride detached flow for so long, but for something real and loving to materialize, it involves engagement and a challenge to your ego. And that's why I'm actually a little bit more forgiving of the self-focused, broad romantic gestures that he attempts on I'll Come Too, which has that faint hint of desperation that he's too reserved to ever fully express, but cuts through regardless. Mostly because it's way more relatable than I'd like to admit. And Power On goes even deeper in admitting his own presumptions. One of the most stark was the one where he was placing her second to his art. All the more ironic given how much a lot of his art has revolved around her on this album. Another unintentionally revealing moment. And that's one reason why James Blake himself had described Don't Miss It as the inner monologue of an egomaniac, because he could so easily escape and swaddle himself in detachment, and man, he knows it. But it has resulted in so many emotional experiences brushed aside or muted, and while that risk to his ego is palpable, he wouldn't miss it for the world to, actually engage, fall in love or something. So as a whole, I definitely understand the criticisms of this album, as these sorts of emotional swings could read as jarring or schmaltzy coming from a presence who before this coasted on detachment, from production to delivery to the content. But that awkwardness is paradoxically translated to stronger grooves, better melodic hooks, and a challenge to artistic and emotional reserve where the more naked moments feel more earned, even if the process to get there can be a little bit tonally misshapen. And make no mistake, those stumbles in the execution do hold this album back from greatness for me. The self-awareness can be kind of inconsistent, and the album absolutely feels kind of transitional for where he's going before, and I don't think it's as good as the first two records he's put out. But the potential reveal with Assume Form is exciting, and I definitely think James Blake is on a fascinating path. So I'm giving this a solid 7 out of 10, an absolute recommendation for me. Folks, you can mostly believe the hype with this one. And while I won't call it great, and it is an easier jumping on point, I'd argue it's even more resonant as an advancement of the previous albums. It's a natural step, and you're gonna want to hear those too. And it's a great step in a really fascinating direction. So yeah, make the time, believe the hype, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm actually a little bit surprised how much I like this without quite loving it. I think this review is going to come across a little bit more positive in that lane, and that's good. This is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this album. So if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I know some of you guys are going to come down on me for not quite loving this enough, but some of the tones just didn't quite work. It's really damn good, but not quite great in a way that really moves me the way I wanted. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved, hey, and help support this channel, link to my Patreon is right over there. I'd be happy for any contributions. I'm still trying to rejigger things. We'll see where things go. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.